It all started with a tweet. Neopronouns and xenogenders genuinely embarrass the LGBT community and leave us looking like fools to everyone. Then, a quote tweet. As soon as we recognize that the problem isn't extra-community respectability, but is rather intra-community attempts at meaningless subversion of gender identity so as to center non-issues, then we'll be able to progress as a community. And then I replied, because I'm an engagement bait whore. Except national trans activism isn't focused on cat genders at all. It's pretty focused on healthcare and legal recognition, none of which are meaningless. Our problems are transphobic institutions, not xenogenders. Move on. So obviously that was based, but I'll also admit that it doesn't actually address the issue. It's a cop-out. If someone brings up something they think is a problem and your reply is, oh, well, that problem isn't actually happening, you run the risk of inadvertently avoiding the substance of the problem. So let's say that xenogenders and neopronouns truly were the focus of national trans activism. Would that be a problem? I'd say, yeah, that would kind of be a problem. If trans activism were portrayed only as the fight over whether you can identify as bungender, then I'd say that that form of trans activism is pretty weak. But I'd also emphasize this part. My problem isn't conceptual. I don't have a problem with xenogenders or neopronouns as an idea. Rather, my problem with xenogender-focused trans activism would be practical. So why is xenogender activism worthy of criticism? Isn't the fight over trans activism about the freedom to identify with whatever you want? And wouldn't cat genders be a part of that? Well, not exactly. A few days ago, I saw an incredibly well-put Instagram post by the account sexchange.tbt that I won't repeat in its entirety, but essentially, the original poster found one of those neogender pronoun kids books filled with a bunch of identities that were probably some gender studies master's thesis. What the fuck is woman? Libra-gender, horogenders, zerls, and zoys. And you could write a bunch of takes about this. Are horogenders the result of the neoliberal obsession with categorization and identification? Are rigid gender taxonomies politically meaningful, or are they just another identity that we can consume in the same way as any other commodity? But I don't know if it's worth criticizing xenogenders if, number one, the people identifying with these identities are probably a genuinely marginalized group, young trans people struggling with gender categories. It's just punching down. And number two, xenogenders aren't even a relevant aspect of activism right now. There is no xenogender lobby. I bring up this Instagram post because I agree with the last sentence of it wholeheartedly. Ultimately, I do think a person should be able to ask that their gender be embraced, but we are so far from living in a world where such an embrace could be anything beyond the symbolic gesture of liberal tolerance. Here's what I synthesize from this discourse. We should live in a world where xenogenders and neopronouns are respected. But xenogenders and neopronouns are absolutely not the means by which we get to that world. Here's a parallel example that might illustrate this statement further. We should live in a world beyond patriarchy where women occupy leadership roles and important social positions, but electing a woman president is not the means through which we dismantle the patriarchy. A whole 10 years ago, when I was just beginning to understand my queer identity, I used to watch a bunch of queer YouTubers. One person I really liked was Ash Hardell. Ash is a trans YouTuber and made a name for themselves back in the day with LGBTQ educational videos. They had a particular affinity for queer identity categories, and I always found their approach interesting. Ash was one of the few people I've ever heard say that they actually love labels.
And the subject I am absolutely jazzed about currently is labels, or the ABCs of LGBT, if you will.
And that seems kind of off-putting in a world where rigid labels are at the root of so many oppressive histories. But again, back to the point made by the great Instagram post. Though it is almost always overly rigid and taxonomical, we often learn about ourselves by negotiating borders and boundaries. Identity play is a normal process of healthy self-discovery.
Maybe you'll even discover a word you never knew existed, but resonates deeply with you.
We should live in a world where young people are allowed to play with words and identities, negotiate what words mean, and what norms should be accepted. We should live in that world. Ash Hardell made me feel safe, and I think that the world would be genuinely better if there were more people like Ash Hardell in the world. But how do we get a world where people are allowed to play and discover their identities through different labels? Do we get there by forcing every workplace to undergo mandatory diversity seminars where a cis person defines every single neopronoun? No, gender, and by extension, trans liberation should not be a battle over labels. Trans liberation is a material fight. It is a movement at the forefront of a longer historical battle in the arena of the body. What should trans activism look like then? Well, we shouldn't think of gender as a free-floating label. Gender is a system of technologies. Our bodies are sites of social signification whose borders have material consequences. Through binary sex, society forces our bodies to fit into certain boxes, to perform certain roles, to occupy certain social places. Historically powerful groups are invested in maintaining a rigid social hierarchy of material oppression. The patriarchal social order forms a key part of this social hierarchy. The material components of what society calls the female body are infused with social meaning, with a social purpose. Those under the material and bodily category of woman occupy a social position that makes unpaid reproductive, domestic, and emotional labor women's historical destinies. Those under the material and bodily category of man occupy a social position that enables male social coercion, the use of violence, both the direct and structural kind, to maintain power, to defend the existing social order with force. All of the gendered elements of the human body are given a biosociological purpose. So, while in reality, testosterone is objectively just some molecule, in a gendered social system, it is technologically infused with meaning and purpose. Testosterone is the vessel of strength, order, and masculinity. Wombs and uteruses are, in a literal way, just organs and flesh. And when they interact with certain molecules in a certain way, new organisms may emerge from them. That's the most literal version of what happens. But in a gendered society, a patriarchal gendered society, wombs and uteruses have a social technological purpose. It is the site of the socially infused category of life. Reproduction, motherhood, and the continuation of the species, of our social destinies. There are laws in place that control what can be done when certain clumps of cells occupy a womb, because there are forces in society that want to maintain a particular hierarchical form of social organization. One in which men control the forceful power of labor and where women submit to a life of uncompensated domestic reproductive labor. It's complicated. I couldn't possibly get into all of this here, but the point is that any activism that seeks gendered freedom must address the limits that our society places on these technologies of gender. For example, laws that ban gender-affirming care places limits on the free movement of gender technologies. Medical institutions place barriers between people and gender technologies like hormones. A truly radical and effective trans activism seeks to break these barriers. Trans activism is a movement that reclaims the means of gendered technological reproduction. Within trans life and identity lies the imminent and radical claim that control over gender technology should not lie in the hands of institutions or governments or corporations, but that these gender technologies should go back to collectives, communities, and individuals. Now sure, pronouns and labels are gender technologies. The identity labels thrust upon us serve as this social schema that marks your social position and has consequences. So, for example, if you are labeled a woman, that's like a kind of shorthand that communicates how people should treat you, what types of hormones you have access to, the type of violence you're exposed to, and so on. The label woman or the pronoun her does stuff in the world, right? These words are powerful and they organize the social order. But with regard to trans people, let's think about the type of stuff that people are currently making laws about. Asking your friends to call you Caesar is not illegal. That doesn't mean that people going by Caesar are embraced by society, but I think that from an activist perspective, we should pay attention to where powerful institutions are trying to maintain social control. The current battle lies in things like gender-affirming care. The state wants to legislate trans people's healthcare away. Gender-affirming care is at the forefront of trans activism. And strategically, that's a good thing. This centers the materiality of the body. The ability to alter the gendered body gets at the heart of the power of the current social order. It is a radical claim, and it is powerful in a way that pronouns are not. Think about this. States around the country are trying to ban gender-affirming care, especially when it comes to minors. But the number one group of children that seek gender-affirming surgery aren't trans kids. Overwhelmingly, it's cisgender boys with gynecomastia who seek normalizing surgeries. Or what about this? Why do so many laws that ban gender-affirming surgeries for minors make exceptions for so-called gender-corrective surgeries on intersex babies? Why is it that puberty blockers have been used by decades for cisgender children with no uproar, but were only seen as dangerous and experimental when trans kids started taking them? Why is it that conservatives seemingly have this principled stance that you shouldn't perform surgeries on children, but have no problem with medical interventions that align children with gendered norms? This should be the type of discourse that we focus on. Why is it that our society has a double standard? Why do we put a cage around the genitals and our hormones and require that even adults need a doctor's note to unlock the cage? We should be precise with this, though. I don't think that the conversation should be let kids get life-altering surgeries on a whim. But I think illustrating the arbitrary distinction between what cisgender kids are allowed to get and what trans kids are allowed to get is fruitful and leads us to the right questions. Our activism should advocate for a freeing of the limits of our gendered system and how we think about it. Why are there so many restrictions on the gendered alterations we can perform on our bodies? Why do institutions pathologize and regulate our desires? This is what trans activism should look like. And it kind of does look like that. So let's keep the conversation here. In a world where gender is liberated, we would embrace xenogenders and neopronouns as a normal facet of identity exploration. I don't think a focus on xenogenders gets us to that world. But while I don't think it should be the focus of LGBT education or activism, anyone that tells you that xenogenders are everything wrong with LGBT activism knows nothing about trans activism. This is a movement that advocates for a freeing of gender technologies. Pronouns are a gender technology, but the freeing of pronouns or of labels does not meaningfully challenge the current liberal order, so it shouldn't be the heart of our discourse. If you're a fellow trans person, don't look at neogenders antagonistically. They should be a part of the world that we want to create.